Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Louisville Forum. I'm our president, Greg Condrum. We meet the second Wednesday of every month at noon at Vincenzo's Restaurant. The Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group founded in 1984. Louisville Forum hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville area. Although we may take up issues of a national interest, we try to highlight the local perspective. For more information about the Louisville Forum or our programs, or to make a reservation, please visit our website, louisvilleforum.org. Today's topic is Louisville, a sanctuary city? ? Our speakers are, let me get back to that. A recent article in the Louisville Courier-Journal led with Cincinnati declaring itself a so-called sanctuary city, Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher is facing renewed calls to follow suit and refuse to turn over undocumented immigrants to federal authorities for deportation. Though no cities or counties in Kentucky have passed sanctuary city laws, the question remains, to what extent should local law enforcement be obligated to enforce federal immigration law? So our speakers today are Senator Whitney Westerfield and Nima Kulkarni. Whitney currently serves as chairman of the Kentucky Senate Judiciary Committee. He ran for Kentucky Attorney General in 2015. He is an attorney with the Fletcher Law Firm in Hopkinsville after serving 5 years as an assistant Commonwealth's attorney. Nima Kulkarni is the managing attorney at Indus Law Firm, focusing on immigration and international business law, helping clients immigrating to the United States. I believe you're up first for speaking. Yeah.
Is this the right level? All right, thank you all for coming. As mentioned, I practice primarily in the field of immigration law. It's been 10 years that I've been doing this year actually, so it seems like forever. But one of the things that I've learned in my practice and in generally dealing with the field of immigration is that the rhetoric often surrounding this area of discussion of law, of legislation, is often divorced from the facts and the context from which it is derived. So I find it helpful to always kind of set the context first before getting into any details, because there's always a number of studies, a number of reports, there's statistics, there's all kinds of data that has been accumulated by the government, by nonprofit organizations that can get a little confusing. And before we kind of get into the weeds, if we even do, I don't know if we have time for that today, I just wanted to kind of set up what we're talking about when we use the term sanctuary city. So I would like to start off with kind of a who, what, when, where, why scenario. So who are we talking about when we're talking about sanctuary cities? Who is affected by this term and these laws and these provisions that we're discussing today? We're talking about the undocumented immigrant population in the United States. That number is hovering at around 11 million individuals, and it has remained fairly stable. So basically what we're talking about, undocumented immigrants, the general idea that might spring to mind is a person that is coming across the southern border from Mexico, primarily Hispanic. While the majority of individuals that are undocumented are Mexican, there's about 52%. There's about 48, and it's rising, so 48, 49% that are from every other country in the world. So it's not just one specific country that we're talking about when we're discussing the undocumented population. It's important to remember that migration from the southern border, whether it's Mexican, Central Americans, has been zero since 2010, and it's been a net negative since 2014. That means more individuals are leaving across the southern border than coming in here. Another important number to remember is that undocumented individuals, about 66, over 2/3%, have been here for over 10 years. So we're not talking about individuals that are sort of new. They've been here, they've established lives and families here. So that's who we're talking about that would be affected by any sanctuary city discussion, provision, legislation. So what are we talking about when we say sanctuary city? This is not a legal term of art. It doesn't actually mean anything. There are various resolutions that you might have heard of that different states and cities and localities have adopted. Basically what they're doing is reinforcing that they're not going to necessarily comply automatically with two specific legal provisions. So we are getting into the legalities of it. It's just that the term itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. What we're discussing specifically is the reintroduction of the Secure Communities Program and the 287G provision, both of which involve basically some level of immigration law enforcement by local authorities. So the discussion there is, are they authorized? What are they asking for? Is this actually benefiting the communities that are being asked to implement them? 287G is a provision that was introduced back in 1996, and Secure Communities was a program that was implemented between 2008 and 2015. Importantly, both of these programs were discontinued because primarily they did not work. And they degraded relations between local law enforcement and immigrant communities wherever they were put into practice. A lot of the sanctuary city resolutions that you're hearing about now have been either been enacted at the behest of and always with the full support of local law enforcement agencies. So it's important to remember that the local authorities don't necessarily want to comply with the reintroduction of these programs that had been introduced, did not work, and they don't want it to be introduced again because there's no evidence basically that it had any impact on crime reduction, and again, it degraded their ability to actually protect and serve their local communities. I don't know how much more time I have, but
What were those programs? I mean, what did they do?
the 287G, okay, so I can get into that. I didn't know if we had time to get into all of the specifics. 287G is a provision that was added in 1996, as I mentioned, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It allows basically the Department of Homeland Security, or back in the day, the immigration enforcement agencies, to essentially deputize local law enforcement because it's actually not legal for a local law enforcement officer to enforce federal immigration laws without something like this agreement in place. So 287G agreements were basically memorandums of understanding where immigration enforcement agencies would train local law enforcement officers, and then they would be able to essentially stop, apprehend, question, interrogate, detain any individuals that they felt or believed to be removable. This could be in the course of their day-to-day activity. So if you see somebody on the street and you think they might be undocumented, you're able to apprehend them under these sorts of agreements. The cost of all of this enforcement activity was borne by the localities. So the federal government would train the officers, and after that, all of the costs would be borne by the local enforcement agencies or localities in terms of actually enforcing these laws. There were obviously issues. It was controversial, not least because of many instances of discrimination and racial profiling, because how do you look at somebody and say that you're undocumented? Based on what? So there were federal judges and different legal challenges that resulted in basically findings of bias, discrimination, racial profiling. This included investigations conducted by the Department of Justice, 2 separate investigations into practices with 287G agreements in place in Arizona. I don't know if you all remember Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He was sort of famous for violating basically every term of those agreements, and specifically his practices and then some other practices in North Carolina resulted in a finding that these were not constitutional. They were not being enacted on a legal basis. Again, that program was discontinued and was replaced in 2008 by what's called the Secure Communities Act, It's not an act, it's really a program. This basically allowed for databases of fingerprints and local arrest records to be accessed by local law enforcement and federal authorities. So they were trying to take the individuals out of the equation and say technology will allow us to decide whether this person could potentially be deportable or removable. Again, this is something that resulted in discriminatory practices, but also in unlawful detention of individuals. So the difference between 287G and the Secure Communities Program is when there was a hit in a federal database where this person might be undocumented or removable from the United States, Immigration and Customs Enforcement would ask that the local jail keep the person, just hold them there, even if they're whatever they were initially arrested for. Maybe it was a fine and they paid it, maybe it was a day in jail and they served it, but they were requesting that they keep the person in detention, in jail, for a period of 48 hours. Now, this didn't happen a lot, so there were periods and instances where people were detained for over 48 hours, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And again, without any other basis other than this request from Immigration and Customs Enforcement that just please hold them until we figure out whether we can pick them up or not. Of course, unconstitutional, legal challenges, federal court decisions, and so that also was phased out. That was phased out in about 2015. So in 2015, what happened was, by that time, essentially, local law enforcement was not in any position to, I guess, want to enforce any immigration laws. So because of the unlawful practices, the unconstitutionality, the legal challenges, they did not want to. So when these programs were being implemented, there were over 400 jurisdictions that refused to comply. So they did not want to do that. They did not want to enforce these programs as they were being told to by the federal government. And that's important because that's exactly what's going on now. So when you're talking about a sanctuary city and a resolution that's been formally adopted by a sanctuary city, all of them will have some provision in there saying that we will not automatically detain an individual simply on the basis of a request from the federal government without some other court order, warrant, or other document that would allow for a legal basis for detention. That's all they're talking about. So there's none of this the rhetoric about we're just harboring illegal aliens, we're just making sure that people that are here on an undocumented basis will just come to our state and we'll just keep them, and we just won't allow federal agencies to come in to our locality. That's not what we're talking about here. There's two very specific legal provisions that they are actively refusing to comply with. And again, when this was in practice, there were hundreds of jurisdictions at the time that also refused to comply with the way they were being asked to implement these programs. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a sanctuary city. Now, that being said, there are formal resolutions that have been adopted by about 171 jurisdictions that are saying we, city of, county of, state of, are adopting this resolution, and it's been voted on by whatever legislative body that needs to approve it. Now, that does not mean that there are not other jurisdictions, Louisville being one of them, where in practice they are not going to honor requests for detention simply on the basis of a request from the federal government without other information or other objective evidence that this person is lawfully able to be detained. So in practice, Louisville has said that it will be essentially a sanctuary city because it will not automatically comply with these two provisions. I think just to kind of get that in context. And in terms of when and why, basically, in January, when the new administration when the new president was sworn in, one of the first acts that was signed was an executive order. You might remember one of the more famous provisions of that was the travel ban, which is still currently being challenged. Some of the parts of it are moving forward. But there were several other provisions in that executive order, one of which was the reinstatement of secure communities and 287G. So there was also a ramping up of hiring in terms of Customs and Border Protection agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents. They did away with basically levels of priority enforcement, saying that now any one of the 11 million individuals are at the same level in terms of the priority for removal. So historically, there have been levels and tiers based on the individual's criminal activity, how many times they violated our immigration laws, any other factors that would either mitigate or exacerbate their removal from the United States. At this point, it doesn't matter, and that's part of the provisions in this executive order. We've heard from the Attorney General that there are threats to cut off funding if jurisdictions do not comply with these provisions. It's unclear, and no details have been provided by that office as to whether that's even legal to do, what funds would be cut off, et cetera, because, again, it is not legal for local law enforcement authorities to enforce federal immigration laws. And then finally, we were talking about 171 sanctuary jurisdictions. About 37 are cities. 4 of them are states. It's California, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have declared their entire state as a sanctuary state. And then the rest are counties that are scattered throughout the country. So that's who we're talking about and where we're talking about all of these provisions happening. One of the things that I want to also point out is part of that executive order was kind of a move towards really criminalizing the act of being here without documentation. I want to reiterate that that is a civil offense. It is not a criminal offense. The way that we treat individuals that are undocumented, we treat them the same way we would a criminal. And so all of these enforcement centric activities is kind of a push towards making someone that's here undocumented, on an undocumented basis, essentially the same as a criminal. And so that is also patently untrue, but that's the rhetoric that's being sort of propagated. And so I just wanted to kind of set that out there. Again, there are a ton of studies, reports, statistics, and I'm sure we'll get into all of that. But by and large, when we're talking about a sanctuary city, we're talking about a jurisdiction that is basically refusing to automatically honor 2 specific legal provisions that have been proven not to work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm not at all going to try to go toe-to-toe with her experience and expertise in this area. And she mentioned a number of things that are not things I was familiar with, but a couple of things that I was. And before I talk specifically about the issue of sanctuary cities and whether or not Louisville should be one, whether or not that's something other communities in Kentucky are exploring or have explored, I want to give you some context about where I am regarding immigration policy generally. And I'm going to share something that I wrote 3 years ago when there was a number of children refugees, a couple hundred that were coming to Kentucky. And now off the top of my head, I can't remember where they were coming from. But that was in the news a great deal, and a lot of rhetoric, not all of it very good or very pleasant, was floating around in the press, both here in Kentucky and nationally. And I felt led to just share some thoughts. And so I put up a Medium post back in 2014, and I want to share that with you, a little amended here. As a state senator, certainly I don't have any vote on federal immigration policy and can't influence it, but as a citizen like you and as a constituent of Congress like you, my opinion matters, yours matters, yours matters. I haven't studied the whole immigration landscape as much as Nima has and as much as some of you may have, but my prosecutorial experience back in Hopkinsville paints my perspective a bit regarding criminal offenders, people actually committed public offenses here in Kentucky, but who were here as undocumented, unlawful aliens here, not here having come through a naturalization process. National security is paramount. It is paramount. I believe it's the first concern that we should have. We must ensure to keep out those who would do us harm or help others to do us harm. We must also hasten the deportation process. I have no patience for those who desire to come here only to leech off of the rest of us and our social support system, which is strained enough as it is. They're taking resources away from us and from our families who work really hard to provide for our own and for our neighbors here in Kentucky. Likewise, I have no time or sympathy for those who arrive only to break our laws. In those two scenarios, the process for extradition, getting them out of here, deportation, must be much faster. I recall being told by an employee of ICE, the nearest ICE office to Hoptown, I believe was in Bowling Green, still is, I assume. And I remember having a couple of guys, 3 or 4 guys that had broken a handful of laws, committed felonies in Christian County. They had been indicted, and we learned that they were here illegally, unlawfully. And I mentioned something to the ICE agent, letting them know we've got these folks here. This was in some year prior to 2012 when I left the office. And they said, Whitney, the time it would take for us to deport them would be long, long after they will have served any sentence I could have given them or they could have agreed to as Class D felons in Christian County or in the state prison system. That's my only experience. And I've heard since I've sat in this seat as chairman, I heard a number of anecdotal situations where it's taken a long time, where family members that have tried to go through the process, but it's taken a long time. Meanwhile, they're sitting there in our county jails or state prisons, and they're sitting there on our dime rather than being back in their native country. I believe that's a little bit nonsense. Security and deportations aside, at the heart of my position is a singular truth I cannot shake. I'm a descendant of immigrants. You're a descendant of immigrants. Our ancestors, far back enough, did little more than sign their name to a ledger book. That was the only thing keeping them or allowing them to get here and live their new American dream, this land of hope. Shouldn't we make the process faster for those who still prefer risking their lives to come here? As long as we maintain our security and the people who come here desire to contribute in some way to the culture and the economy of America, why would we inhibit that? Why would we get in the way? We aren't running out of space, at least not yet. Obviously, the border situation requires nuance. We must find a way to properly balance our need for security with our foundational goal of freedom. Are we permitting terrorists from any nation unguarded entry? Are we removing any such terrorists swiftly once they're found? Are we doing what's best for immigrant children by detaining them or sending them back? If the children stay, where do they live? News reports from the time indicated, as I said earlier, 200 or so these children were coming to Kentucky. Who feeds them? For how long? Who teaches them English or any other base subject so they can function minimally in our society? If they were sent home, will they actually get to go home? What is home? Are there parents there? Not T-H-E-I-R. Are there any parents or adults there to provide for them or take them and provide and care for them? As terrible as we may feel it is for a parent to send a small child or teenager alone on an illegal trip across the border, can we be certain it wasn't for the best? Perhaps those kids are facing a much harsher reality at home than they are here. Weren't our ancestors often fleeing horrid conditions in the hope of finding greener pastures and hope here? Assuming we've satisfied our legitimate security concerns, how can we turn anyone away from the nation that welcomes all comers, especially those in search of hope? And I'll quote this, and you'll recognize it in a second. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It's from New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, which is on the base of the Statue of Liberty. That sonnet containing that famous phrase appears on a plaque at the Statue of Liberty, greeting citizens and immigrants alike. However we as a nation respond to immigration policy, I believe we would do well to remember these words, bearing in mind where we came from and what makes our nation so great. Sanctuary cities poses a really interesting conversation about immigration policy and brings up a lot of other issues that are not necessarily specifically limited just to whether or not a city obeys or cooperates with local, or rather federal law enforcement. It raises a number of questions about what we should do as a country and where our failings are. And Nima points out some serious flaws and failures. I wasn't familiar with those two programs, but to the extent that they are creating disproportionate treatment of immigrants, those aren't working. To the extent the new administration's executive order reinstates those, I don't believe that that's going to work either. I agree with the idea that we shouldn't criminalize this behavior, and you're right. Immigrants are treated very much as felons, treated the same as a heroin trafficker or cocaine dealer or someone else that's broken some sort of public offense, some sort of law against the people. And some of them, I assume, come here with that in mind, but most are coming here, I assume, because here is better than where they're coming from. I disagree with the idea of a sanctuary city in the sense that I do fear that it would create a safe harbor for people who are avoiding and evading federal law enforcement. I do have that concern. And you've seen news reported here in Louisville, you've seen in news stories around the country where people who have been here and even who have been caught and deported a number of times have broken some law only to be sent back, only to come back again. I don't have any tolerance for that. It shows a disrespect for all of us as citizens here in the Commonwealth and in this country. It shows a disrespect for their freedoms that they enjoy here. And so I do have concerns about sanctuary cities providing that sort of safe harbor. But I think if you were to create sanctuary cities, and certainly communities have, and Louisville's talked about it. I know Mayor Fisher has faced calls for that. I don't know if the council here has ever tried to officially do anything. I haven't tracked it that closely, but I know that there's a desire to do that from a lot of folks in Louisville and Jefferson County. But I think if you do that without changing some of the underlying problems with the immigration system, you're doing a disservice to those immigrants, to your community. I think you do create a safe harbor for not just the ones who are here that want to have hope and a better life, but also for the ones that I think are clearly trying to avoid detection and avoid criminal action, or who have committed a crime and are trying to avoid that. I say, why not, if you're going to give them a place to be, give them an opportunity to seek a way to become a legal, naturalized citizen of the United States. Lower that bar tremendously. Address the national security concerns, which I agree. I started with saying that they are paramount. I think they are, and they should be. And in a time of terrorism around the entire world, I absolutely think that's not going to change and shouldn't. But that doesn't mean we don't let people in. That doesn't mean we make that difficult. We've come quite a long way in terms of cumbersomeness, if that's a word. Morgan, is that a word? Thanks. If Morgan McGarvey says it's a word, I'm going with it. But we've but we've come a long way since simply signing your name to a ledger. Haven't we? It shouldn't be that daggum hard. It shouldn't be that daggum hard to have people who break the law to get out. We rely on in our economy, we rely on in our communities. I don't just mean financially and economically. We are a nation of immigrants, and we shouldn't turn immigrants away. But instead of criminalizing it, and instead of giving those who would do us harm a place to hide and be safe, and there are people who take advantage of that. I have no idea. How in the world do you determine whether or not that's a majority? I'll give you, for instance, when we passed the heroin bill in 2015, when we passed, not the heroin bill in 2015, when House Bill 463, before I was in the Senate, passed in 2011, they set a new quantity element for trafficking and controlled substances. For heroin, it was 2 grams. For meth, cocaine, it was 4 grams. You have people who deal commercially in both of those that would sell 1.8 grams of heroin and 3.8 grams of meth or cocaine. Not because they were just small-time people, because they know what the law is and they take advantage of loopholes and opportunities. And I'm not saying that's the majority. I don't think that it is. But I think it's foolish for us to think that that doesn't ever happen. And so instead of giving that opportunity to exist, why don't we couple this safe place for immigrants to be with an opportunity to more swiftly become Americans, to contribute and not live in fear. I don't want them to live in fear. I want them to be here. I want them to be here and be a part of my community, your community, because they've got a lot to offer. Anyway, that's that. Happy to take your questions whenever you're ready.
Okay, so our 2 questioners today are Tom van der Rostein and Joe Arnold. Hey, I just wanted to ask about something that I think caught a lot of us off guard. You just mentioned it too. This idea that we've got civil law and criminal law, right? And you'd said this is on the civil side, not the criminal side. And the first thing that came to mind was, well, even traffic violations are considered under the criminal side. So how is a traffic violation criminal, but coming unlawfully into the country not? So can you maybe talk about that?
It's basically being here without any documentation is a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense. That's just the way our system was set up. And speaking of traffic violations, the majority of individuals that are picked up through any of these programs or through the increased enforcement activities are for traffic stops. So they are not high-level criminals. They're not even rising to the level of maybe misdemeanors. We're talking about broken taillights. We're talking about driving without a driver's license in a lot of cases. But I don't know why that might rise to the level of criminal law, and this is civil, but that's just how our code is written. Being caught at the border, entering without documentation is a criminal offense, punishable by up to 6 months detention and a fine of somewhere, I think the maximum is like $2,500. So that's the only sort of provision that has a fine or any detention time allotted to it. But again, just being here, existing in the United States without a visa, without any documentation is a civil offense. It is not, and never will itself rise to the level of a criminal.
So the act of entering is criminal, but the status of remaining here is not.
Right, so if
So
you were
that's-
picked up, like if I don't have my green card on me or my naturalization certificate or something like that, you're not, and I'm undocumented, assuming I don't have either of those things, I'm not, it shouldn't be a criminal offense. It should be treated as a civil offense, but of course it's not. It's handled on a practical level as a criminal matter.
Yeah, that distinction helps. So you guys have a first question?
There's a number of financial questions that people are asking. This is for both of our panelists. Who would pay for the local detention if someone is picked up
The locals.
and held for ICE? So would that be the
local.
local municipality or the
In
state?
fact, ICE says, and you can
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but they've actually said we won't pay for it.
Yeah, they will not pay for any of that.
Simple.
This is a similar question. In your example of a person detained by local authorities on the sole basis of a request from the federal government, when the legality of the detainment is questioned, which entity bears the cost and responsibility of defending the actions taken?
Do you mean the individual or the jurisdiction?
Jurisdiction.
The jurisdiction. So the jurisdiction, the local jurisdiction's only role in any of this is to hold the person. That's it. So any moving forward of their immigration violations in immigration court, them being removed from the United States, all of that is taken care of through the Department of Justice or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But the local role would simply be to hold that individual in a local jail or detention facility.
It's been litigated quite a bit, but even if an agency did cooperate and inform, they can't hold someone past when they were already going to be releasable, if that makes sense. So if they stop them for a broken tail light or for a DUI or whatever, and I said, would you please hold them, and they cooperated, they can't hold them anything longer than what they would ordinarily have kept someone in on whatever charge it is.
While we're on cost questions, I'll do a follow-up for Senator Westerfield. What is the total cost per immigrant in relation to schooling, health care, food, shelter, clothing, work training, wraparound social services per city and state per year? And what is the number that a city of Louisville's population could effectively assimilate per year?
You know, that was the next question I was going to write the answer down to before I walked in here. I guess I should have gone one further. I have no idea what the answer to those questions are. I can find that out and provide that to you all through the board, but I don't know the answer to it off the top of my head.
Do you have a general response, though, to the basis of the question, which basically is, to what extent could a city of Louisville or a state of Kentucky, the assimilation question?
My assumption is it's bound to be relatively minimal. 11 million immigrants in the nation. I don't know how many are estimated to be in Kentucky, but relative to the cost in social support services we provide to every other Kentucky family and across the Commonwealth, my assumption is that it's probably not a substantial number, at least in comparison.
Can I just add a couple things? So it is difficult to estimate the undocumented population, even nationwide. So this 11 million is coming from Department of Homeland Security, but it, again, is an estimate. The estimates for Kentucky as a state range from 30 to 60,000 potentially undocumented individuals. Now, these can include undocumented parents with U.S. citizen children or other individuals, family members that are here legally. I do want to make a point that nobody is able to take advantage of or leech any public means tested benefits. They are not eligible for food stamps. They are not eligible for Social Security. They're not eligible for any of that. Even green card holders aren't eligible for a lot of that until they've been here for at least 5 or 10 years. So there is no significant drain simply because they're not allowed to. So, and there are always anecdotes, and I've gone to Frankfurt where people are saying there's tremendous fraud, there's Social Security fraud, there's benefits fraud, because I had an aunt who was in line and she didn't get benefits, but this family of Mexican-looking people did, and therefore it's all just fraudulent. The Social Security Administration in Kentucky said that they had, of course, they provide reports of any such, fraudulent incidences, and they don't have any significant. It's statistically insignificant if they found anything, and it was not something that an immigrant was doing on purpose in order to defraud the system. So I just want to make that clear.
I agree with what she just said. She's right, but there is fraud, state benefit fraud. And that happens quite a bit. I don't have numbers off the top of my head to give, but there are a lot of the benefit cards they don't have a photo. They don't necessarily have a name. There are not any meaningful ways to control who in a household can use a given card. Cards are sold for cash in exchange for cash, so that someone who wasn't supposed to have the card now has it and can use it, and the clerk at the store doesn't know the difference. And the person who was supposed to have the card has cash that they can then use to buy something that the card couldn't be used to buy. I don't know that it happens, that it's rampant, but it does take place.
Not necessarily specifically with immigrants either.
No, you're right. That's also right.
This is a question for both panelists. Please state your position, if you have one, on Cates Law, which has been proposed to the United States Congress.
Right, so this is another sort of prong in the push to sort of conflate criminality with immigrants and individuals that are here on an undocumented basis. Kate's Law is basically, I forget the full name of the individual, but it was somebody that was, I think, murdered by somebody that had been here on an undocumented basis, but that had, I think, had repeated violations. So they had left or been deported and had come back, and then ultimately this violence had occurred. There's also a provision called VOICE, which is the victims of immigration crime enforcement, where it's a hotline you call in and say, I'm the victim of a crime perpetrated by an immigrant. They do not, differentiate between undocumented or documented immigration or immigrants. But Kate's Law is based on, again, one instance, and a lot of these are anecdotal. And I just want to also point out that, historically speaking, your chances of being the victim of a violent crime perpetrated by either a refugee or an immigrant, whether they're here documented or not, they're astronomical. So it's like 1 in 3 billion, your odds of getting, being the victim of a violent crime from a refugee, perpetrated by a refugee, and it's similarly astronomical for an immigrant generally, whether they're undocumented or not. So these are not instances that are common. They are extremely rare, and Kate's Law is an attempt to act like they're far more widespread than they are. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be legislation, there shouldn't be recognition of any crimes perpetrated by an individual here that's on an undocumented basis, but this conflation of criminality and immigration is something that I am concerned about.
I'm not sure how I feel about Kate's Law. I have the same concerns that she's expressed there. I still think it doesn't, if we don't couple legislation that addresses repeat undocumented immigrants and the issues that with the conduct that they carry out once they're here. If we do that, but we still don't address the underlying slowdowns and impediments to becoming a naturalized citizen, I think we're missing the point. If it weren't so darn hard to get here and be here legally and lawfully and documented and become a naturalized citizen, if it didn't take years for that to happen, perhaps there'd be less of a desire for people to hop in a boat across the Rio Grande or from wherever they're coming. I feel like we're missing the biggest part of the problem.
I'm going to read 3 slips back to back to back, which are similar.
Same guy that asked first question, I guess.
Exactly right. First is a comment, and then there's 2 questions. The comment is, we are a nation of laws, not avoidance of laws, no margin of error. Second question, immigration law is selectively enforced. Doesn't that undermine all law? And the final one, we'll direct this to Senator Westerfield first. When state and local governments openly conspire to disregard federal laws or instructions, does this tell citizens it's okay to disobey laws or regulations they disagree with?
I'll take the last one first. I think you do run that risk a bit, and sort of also answer either the first or the second one. When you've got different jurisdictions doing different things, you can end up with perversely different results and outcomes, and you get justice by geography, which is an issue that we see within our own state border on a host of issues. I see it a lot in juvenile justice matters. You see it on the adult side as well, where it depends on what county you get arrested in as to what happens to you, or whether or not you're charged with this or charged with that, or because of the discretion that's involved, and the discretion that is key to the system. Otherwise, you get really terrible results like mandatory minimums, which are not good. So I think you create a lot of confusion there and a lot of different results, which is not good. And I think it's a slippery slope for us to get on if we're, law enforcement right now, local law enforcement right now may pick somebody up on a drug charge, and then it gets swooped in by the feds and prosecuted federally. There are already examples where our local law enforcement are the eyes and ears, intentionally or not, are the eyes and ears for our federal law enforcement and prosecutors. And I don't know that adding this is going to create a big problem. I don't think requiring or asking folks to cooperate on the immigration side is any different from that. And I think if you continue to allow communities to avoid it, communities, counties, states, whatever, What's the next thing they're not going to do? What's the next thing they aren't going to participate in or cooperate with? Anyway, I think it creates some really interesting questions about what else might be next if a county or state doesn't like X, Y, or Z.
To start off with, I get that a lot. So we're a nation of laws. Why can't they just come here legally? Why don't they do it the right way? And I want to point out that there is a general understanding or feeling or belief that on the part of the majority of Americans that our immigration system is somehow a rational system and that it makes sense and that it actually allows for any provisions where a person could conceivably come here legally and stay here and work here and build a life. That does not exist in our system. It has been restrictionist since the 1790s, and it has been restrictive against certain populations and certain nationalities throughout our history. So it's not a situation where we have had a really thoughtful plan in terms of our immigration system or a template or any kind of system that hasn't been cobbled together in a reactionary manner based on we need foreign labor to build our railroads, to farm our, to perform field labor for our farms when our able-bodied soldiers were off at war, and then now we don't want them anymore. That's essentially been the ebb and flow of our immigration system. So to say that it's a nation of laws is fine. Congress has failed repeatedly to even present, and if presented, to pass any kind of comprehensive immigration reform that would make a rational change to our system, that would actually allow somebody to stay here, even on a temporary basis. Forget citizenship. I mean, that's hard enough for somebody that's had a green card for years. It's a nation of laws, but our immigration laws are irrational, and they are outdated, and they don't make any sense for where we are as a country and where we are as a global nation. Demographics have changed, our needs have changed, our economy has changed, and our immigration laws are not reflecting that. And I have forgotten the other two questions.
I think you attacked it.
This is three questions I think that all are similar, and the questioners want to know, would Louisville or any other, I guess, jurisdiction in Kentucky see adverse economic consequences from businesses or tourism if the legislature passed a law preventing Louisville from asserting sanctuary status? And then what would, I guess on the converse side is, what would be the damage to Louisville financially if it was a formal sanctuary city?
I haven't heard of any other state. There have been other states. Nima could say, I'm sure, better than I could. I know Tennessee is one that I looked at in anticipation of today's talk. They actually passed theirs that prohibited local governments or entities of state and local governments from creating a sanctuary city environment. They passed theirs in 2009. And just this summer, Metro Council in Nashville were talking about creating some sort of a policy for law enforcement to make them as a sanctuary city or jurisdiction, if you will. And I believe it was defeated, but in any event, that law that the question was about has been on the books since 2009, and I haven't heard a peep about there being some sort of detrimental impact to that. For what it's worth, there was a bill filed this year in Kentucky. It was so popular that it got 0 hearings and never moved out of the committee it was referred to in the House. So in fairness, I haven't heard anybody asking me to move such a bill or advance that cause, but I'm not familiar with any economic impact. And I'd like to think we would have heard about it. We hear about whenever any other bill that we pass, valid or not, we hear about whether or not there's been an economic impact that's adverse because of this bill or that bill, and I haven't heard a peep out of any other states about this.
So I'd like to go back to 2010 when Arizona passed laws similar. So we're going back to Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and Alabama also passed laws similar to this. So they basically codified these 287G agreements and secure communities, saying that our police can stop you if they feel that you're not documented, they can detain you, they can do all of the things that I had outlined in those two provisions. They experienced billions of dollars in losses in their agricultural industry because everybody left. So all of their workers either didn't show up to work or they left and fled to other states, not sanctuary states, just they had to get out of there because their families were in danger of being picked up and deported. So there has been documented impact for provisions
go.
like this. So, and they're significant. And so that's something that I think everyone should, and for what? I mean, what are we talking about? I'd like to also point out that this is not something that the government is asking or requesting. They are wanting to mandate this nationwide. They want every jurisdiction to require its law enforcement officials to enforce immigration laws based on these two provisions. So it's not a request, they're not asking nicely, and so that's why you get this discussion and you get this pushback from localities.
I think we have time for one final question, and it kind of circles back to your opening remarks, Ms. Kulkarni. If immigration has been net neutral since 2010, why do we need sanctuary cities?
Because there is being engendered, I guess, an atmosphere of intimidation. So you're talking about the same population, and like I mentioned, the majority of that population, the undocumented population, has been here for at least 10 years. In some situations, 20, 30, 40 years. They are not, we don't have, let me just put it this way, we do not have the resources to pick up every single person that doesn't have documentation and deport them, even if we just push them across the southern border and don't return them to whichever country they originally came from. So I don't think that it's a situation where you need sanctuary cities. I think this is more of a response to an administration that is trying to force this culture of criminalizing immigration, basically. And so you have these jurisdictions that are saying, we will not necessarily comply with those provisions, and we don't agree with them. We don't agree with the motives behind those provisions or this push to require us to comply with them. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't want to lose conventions. They don't want to lose immigrants coming here. And this is not specific to undocumented anymore, because you've got professors and researchers and STEM students that are also feeling this way, that they are not welcome in our country. So I think this language that you find in sanctuary city resolutions simply echoes the feeling of the constituents or the legislatures there that we welcome you as immigrants, and we want you to come here, and we want you to live here and work here, and pay taxes here, and build your lives here. So I don't know necessarily that we need sanctuary cities. Again, this is a term that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It comes from, faith-based organizations providing sanctuary to refugees back in the 1980s. So it can mean a lot of different things, but in the context that we're talking about right now, what they're trying to say is that we're, not complying with these two very specific provisions because they didn't work then and they're not going to work now, and to really just reassure immigrant populations that already live in those jurisdictions or that they want to attract to those jurisdictions, and say we don't agree with this general atmosphere that is being fostered.
Awesome. Big hand for our two speakers. Stacy, do we know where that cup is that was going around? So I'll go ahead and pass one over to you, and right up here.
I get the
How
one
can
with
we
all
be
the
sure that's
fingerprints.
the same cup?
Awesome, thank you. And we are adjourned. Now, don't forget, on the 20th, Cocktails and Conversation, Cafe Lulu Food and Drink. But yeah, in St. Matthews. Check it out. It's on our website. Thanks much.